watching how many snaps some of these guys get in the backfield, it's going to be very, very imperative. And then, we could transition to the wide receiver group. I didn't mention, want to think this would turn into a Texans podcast here, but there are some needs and there are some glaring holes, at least in those depth positions, that I think is a great conversation here, Rod.
Yeah, and so that leads me to mine and part of yours, because you put wide receiver 2 in there, and
Yeah.
this may play into it, and that's Tank Dell versus the field, right? Because Tank Dell was the number 2 receiver last year to Nico Collins, as far as yardage was concerned. Anyways, Nico Collins with his 1,000-yard receiving season, but then like it was a pretty huge gap. I mean, 667 yards to 1,000. That's a pretty big gap between wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2. However, Tank Dell did that in 14 games. Right? Nico Collins only played 12, still got his 1,000 yards, but Tank Dell filled in quite admirably as Nico Collins went down and in 14 games got to 667 yards, only 3 touchdowns in that span. But the next leading pass catcher there was Dalton Schultz, who played all 17 games for the Texans with 532 yards, and then Stephon Diggs in 8 games, 496 yards. So obviously, we know that that one of those problems is gone now, and so now it's Nico Collins, right? And then you've got Christian Kirk, who we talked about in episode 1. You got Justin Watson coming over from Kansas City, but then you got Tank Dell, right, listed behind Nico in the overall depth chart. But the question remains, though. I mean, you brought in a couple of decent utility receivers in Christian Kirk and Justin Watson, as we talked about in episode 1. What does that do to Tank Dell? And how do we approach him now? Is he still going to see the same number of looks that he did last year? Is he still going to get the same kind of love from CJ Stroud as he did last year? Nico Collins coming in and obviously taking over everything from them. But I don't know. To me, I still have faith in Tank Dell, because he was definitely a darling when he
Mm-hmm.
came in. But I don't know how much those other 2 receivers are going to kind of cloud that wide receiver room for him.
And the question also is, like, is Tank Dell even going to play this season? Because that injury occurred in December, right? And when we talk about the type of injury that he suffered a dislocated kneecap, torn ACL, MCL, and LCL. So I'm honestly not expecting him to play at all this season. If he does, it may be in January. Rod, and I just looked at it just to double check, fact check ourselves. That's what a lot of the reports are saying, and that's everything that I've heard as well. And they said the Texans said, we're taking our time with Tank Dell because we know what this guy brings to the offense, and we want him to be 110% healthy before we bring him back. So now the conversation is, okay, they drafted those the 2 receivers out of Iowa State in Jayden Higgins and Jaylin Noel for a reason, right? You brought in Christian Kirk for a reason. So it seems like that Christian Kirk will probably fill that number 2 spot, but he's more of a downfield threat. I think we talked about Christian Kirk in the first episode as well for this Texans team. So my eyes are honestly going to be on those 2 guys that they drafted out of Iowa State, whether it's Higgins or whether it's Noel. Both those guys have explosive playmaking ability. John Metchie, I know he also had a medical condition that he was dealing with. It's great to see him back on the field. Maybe he can fill that 4th spot down the depth chart. But if one of these 3 guys, whether it's Christian Kirk, Noel, or Higgins, can take some of that pressure off of Nico Collins, I'm still expecting Nico Collins to be or have another monster season like he did last year here, Rod. And look, you mentioned the name Dalton Schultz. Don't be surprised if he's like a top 3, top 4 fantasy tight end by the end of the season. When we look back at it and say, hey, Dalton Schultz had close to 1,000 yards and maybe 6, 7 touchdowns, it's going to be for a reason, because he's one of the guys that CJ Stroud does trust on this offense. And he's been with him for his first 2 years, obviously, with CJ Stroud there. So, and again, I can hate keep saying it, Rod, but I'm going to be watching the preseason, not only as a fan, but to see which one of these guys does flourish in this offense with CJ Stroud, the amount of times that he does take snaps, or just overall with the backups that they do have on this team.
Yeah, because whoever is that wide receiver 2, whoever emerges, is definitely going to have fantasy value and probably will be going late in drafts. And that way you have the opportunity to snatch him up, because everybody's going to be going after Nico Collins and nobody's going to want to go after the number 2. So I highly, highly suggest you keep an eye on, like Munaf said, the preseason to figure out who shakes out on that one.